The burger that broke her. When a German female soldier saw a hamburger and couldn't hold back her tears, the smell hit Corporal Greta Hoffmann before she even saw what was making it. Rich, fatty, unmistakable. The scent of cooking meat drifted through the chain-link fence of the Texas POW camp and straight into her starving, disbelieving brain. It was August 1945, 3 months after Germany's surrender, and Greta had been a prisoner for exactly 47 days. 47 days of expecting execution. 47 days of waiting for the torture she'd been promised would come. 47 days of wondering if the Americans would do to her what she'd heard German soldiers did to enemy prisoners. Instead, they'd given her a bed. Clean water, soap, medicine for the infected cut on her arm that had been turning septic when she was captured. And now, impossibly, the smell of cooking meat was making her knees weak and her mouth flood with saliva so fast she had to swallow 3 times in quick succession. Hoffmann. Sergeant Weber's voice snapped her back to attention. The older woman stood rigid in her faded Wehrmacht uniform, her face carved from stone and discipline. Eyes forward. "Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you weak." But Greta couldn't help it. Her eyes tracked toward the source of the smell, the American mess hall, where off-duty soldiers were having what looked like a celebration. Through the windows, she could see them laughing, talking, and eating something she couldn't quite make out from this distance. Something on round bread, something that made her stomach twist with a hunger so violent it felt like being stabbed. She was 23 years old and hadn't eaten real meat in 2 years. The last time had been Christmas 1943, when her unit in France had been given a tiny portion of horse meat as a special ration. Before that, it had been 3 years since she'd tasted beef, real beef, the kind her father used to grill on summer Sundays before the war, before the rationing, before everything turned to ash and blood and screaming. "They're grilling hamburgers," whispered Private Liesel Koch, a radio operator who stood next to Greta in the afternoon roll call. Liesel was 19, captured during the final chaotic days in Berlin when she'd been manning a communication post. "I can see them through the fence. Hamburgers, Greta, with cheese. And what looks like, I think it's lettuce." "Real vegetables. Silence," Weber barked, but her voice cracked slightly. Even she couldn't completely hide her reaction to that smell. Even she, who'd served in the Wehrmacht for 12 years, who'd maintained discipline through retreat after retreat, who'd kept her unit functioning when everything around them collapsed. Even she was just human. Just a hungry human who remembered what food used to taste like. But the real shock was yet to come. Because that evening, after roll call was dismissed and the German women returned to their barracks, something unprecedented happened. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life. It usually only announced roll calls and work assignments, and a voice spoke in heavily accented but understandable German. "Attention all prisoners. Tomorrow is a special day in America called Labor Day. It is a holiday celebrating workers. In honor of this holiday, and in recognition of your cooperation during your time here, Camp Command has authorized a special meal for all prisoners tomorrow at noon. You will be served the same food as American personnel. Report to Mess Hall B at 1200 hours. That is all. The barracks erupted. Not in joy. These women were too disciplined, too traumatized, too German for that, but in shocked whispers that rippled through the bunks like electricity. Sergeant Weber immediately called for order, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Listen to me. This is a test. They are testing our discipline, our loyalty, our worthiness as German soldiers. We will attend this meal because we are ordered to, but we will maintain our dignity. We will not act like starving animals. We will not give them the satisfaction of seeing us grovel for their food. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Jawohl, Herr Feldwebel" echoed through the barracks, but Greta heard the tremor in the voices. She felt it in her own throat. Because whatever Weber said about dignity, they were all thinking the same thing. Real food. Actual meat. Maybe vegetables that hadn't been boiled into gray mush. Maybe bread that wasn't sawdust and air. Maybe, God, she hardly dared think it, maybe enough food that you didn't go to bed with your stomach cramping. That night, Greta lay in her bunk and tried not to think about hamburgers. Tried not to remember the last time she'd eaten one. She'd been 16, the summer before the war officially started, though everyone knew it was coming. Her father had taken the family to a restaurant in Hamburg, an American-style restaurant that was already being boycotted by the more fervent Nazi supporters. But her father didn't care about politics. "A man should eat good food when he can," he'd said. God knows what's coming. The hamburger had been enormous. Served on a soft white bun with cheese that melted over the edges, crisp lettuce, ripe tomato, and some kind of sauce that was tangy and sweet at the same time. Greta had bitten into it and felt like she was tasting America itself. Excessive, indulgent, delicious in a way that felt almost sinful. Her little sister Anna had gotten sauce all over her face and laughed until she hiccuped. Her mother had smiled, really smiled, not the tight, worried smile she'd been wearing for months, and her father had ordered them all chocolate milkshakes because why not? Because the world was about to catch fire and you might as well eat ice cream while you could. Anna was 14 when she died in the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. Her mother had died in the same raid. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front 6 months earlier. Greta was the last Hoffmann alive, and she was lying in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, trying not to cry over the memory of a hamburger she'd eaten 7 years ago when the world still made sense. "Greta!" Liesel's voice came from the bunk below. "Are you awake?" "Yes." "Do you think it's true? The special meal?" "I don't know." "What if it's like you said, a test? What if they're seeing which of us are weak? What if they're—" "Liesel." Greta's voice was sharper than she intended. "Stop. We'll find out tomorrow. Speculation helps no one." But she was speculating too. They all were. In the darkness of Barrack 6, 43 German women lay awake, thinking about food, thinking about home, thinking about everything they'd lost and everything they'd done and everything that might happen tomorrow. Some prayed, quietly, because public religion had been discouraged in the Wehrmacht, but privately they still remembered the prayers their mothers taught them. Some cried silently into their thin pillows. Some, like Sergeant Weber, lay rigid, with discipline and denial, refusing to let hope touch them, because hope was dangerous and hope could break you faster than any interrogation. And that's when something nobody expected happened. The barracks door opened, not kicked open, not thrown open with violence, but opened normally, like someone just walking into a room. Every woman sat up instantly, hearts pounding. Night visits meant trouble. Night visits meant selections, interrogations, midnight punishments. But it was just a young American guard, maybe 20 years old, with a flashlight and an uncomfortable expression. Sorry to bother you ladies," he said in English. Then, reading from a piece of paper in heavily accented German, "I am Gefreiter, Private Jackson. I am told some of you do not eat. Pork? Because of religion? Tomorrow meal has pork bacon on hamburgers. If you do not eat pork, please tell me now, so kitchen knows to make special hamburgers for you. That is all. Gut Nacht." He left before anyone could respond, the door closing softly behind him. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Liesel started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that she muffled with her hands. "They're asking about dietary restrictions. We're prisoners of war, and they're asking about dietary restrictions like we're guests at a hotel." "It's propaganda," Weber said flatly from her bunk. "They want us to report back to Germany that Americans are generous. They want to use us for their political purposes." "Or," said a quiet voice from the back of the barracks, it was Corporal Margarete Steiner, a nurse who'd served in a field hospital in Italy. "Or maybe they're just being decent. Maybe they actually care if we eat food that violates our beliefs. Maybe they're actually treating us like human beings." "There are no human beings in war," Weber snapped. "There are only soldiers and enemies." "The war is over, Sergeant," Margarete said, and there was something in her voice that made everyone hold their breath. "Germany surrendered. Hitler is dead. The Reich is gone. Maybe, just maybe, we're allowed to be human beings again." Weber didn't respond. What could she say? It was all true. The war was over. They had lost, not just lost, but been utterly destroyed. Their cities in ruins, their country occupied, their entire way of life shattered. They were sitting in an enemy prison camp, waiting to be sent home to a home that no longer existed. And tomorrow, they were going to eat hamburgers. The next morning, the women of Barrack 6 woke early and prepared themselves with the same meticulous discipline they'd maintained since capture. They washed with the small bars of soap they'd been issued, real soap, not the sandy substitute they'd had in Germany. They brushed their teeth with actual toothpaste. They combed their hair and straightened their worn uniforms as best they could. Sergeant Weber inspected them like they were heading into battle, correcting collar angles and checking that boots were laced properly. "We will enter that mess hall with dignity," she reminded them. "We will eat what we are given without complaint and without excessive enthusiasm. We will thank them politely in German and return to barracks in formation. We represent the German people, and we will not shame our nation with poor behavior. Understood?" "Jawohl, Herr Feldwebel." At precisely 1200 hours, the women of Barracks 6 marched to Mess Hall B in perfect formation, 3 columns of 14 women with Weber at the front. Other barracks were arriving too. Nearly 200 German female prisoners in total, mostly military personnel captured in the final months of the war. Nurses, radio operators, administrative clerks, drivers, even a few Luftwaffe auxiliary personnel who'd manned anti-aircraft guns. All of them had been told the same thing by their superior officers: maintain discipline, show no weakness, represent Germany with pride. But when they entered the mess hall, discipline became very difficult to maintain, because the Americans hadn't just prepared hamburgers. They had prepared a feast. Long tables were set up with red and white checkered tablecloths, like something from a picture book, like something from before the war. Each place had a real plate, real silverware, a cloth napkin, and a glass of what looked like lemonade with actual ice cubes floating in it. Ice cubes. In August. In Texas. As if energy and resources were so abundant you could waste them on keeping drinks cold. And the food. Dear God, the food. At the serving line, American soldiers in clean white aprons were grilling hamburgers on enormous grills. Not 1 or 2, but dozens at a time. The patties were thick and juicy, the cheese melting perfectly over them. There were buns, soft, white, fresh buns that looked like they'd been baked that morning. There were tomatoes sliced so thick and red they looked like they'd come straight from a garden. There was lettuce, crisp and green. There were pickles, onions, bottles of red ketchup and yellow mustard. There were French fries, mountains of them, golden and crispy, the kind Greta hadn't seen since before the war. There was potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans. There was watermelon sliced into perfect triangles. There was pie, apple pie and cherry pie, sitting on a side table like they were nothing special. It was obscene. It was impossible. It was more food than Greta had seen in one place in 5 years. And it was for them, for prisoners, for enemies, for women who'd fought against America, who'd served the Reich, who'd been part of the military machine that had tried to conquer the world. And the Americans were serving it to them with smiles, asking in broken German if they wanted cheese on their burgers, if they preferred mustard or ketchup, if 1 hamburger was enough or if they'd like 2. Greta stood in line, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. The woman in front of her, a corporal from Dresden named Hilda, accepted her hamburger with trembling hands and whispered, "Danke," so quietly it was barely audible. When Greta reached the front of the line, a young American soldier, he couldn't have been more than 19, smiled at her and said in terrible German, "Hallo! Hamburger mit Käse? With cheese?" Greta nodded, not trusting her voice. He assembled the burger in front of her with casual expertise, patty on the bun, cheese, lettuce, tomato, pickles, a generous squirt of ketchup and mustard. Then he added a massive scoop of French fries to her plate and topped it with a handful of pickle chips. "Extra fries," he said proudly. "Sehr gut." "Very good." He was so earnest, so genuinely pleased to be giving her food, that Greta felt something crack inside her chest. She carried her overloaded plate to a table where several women from her barracks were already sitting, all of them staring at their food like it might be a hallucination. Sergeant Weber sat at the head of the table, her spine rigid, her face carefully neutral. "Eat slowly," she instructed. "Our stomachs are not accustomed to this kind of richness. Eat slowly and maintain dignity." But the real shock was yet to come. Because when Greta picked up the hamburger, warm, heavy, impossible in her hands, and took her first bite, something inside her completely shattered. The taste exploded across her tongue. Beef, real beef, juicy and perfectly seasoned. The cheese was creamy and rich. The vegetables were fresh, crisp, alive. The bun was soft and slightly sweet. It was everything she remembered from that restaurant in Hamburg 7 years ago, but 1,000 times more intense because she hadn't tasted anything like it in so long, and she started to cry. Not delicate tears, ugly gasping sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside her she didn't know it existed. Her hands shook so violently she had to set the hamburger down before she dropped it. The table went silent. Other tables fell silent. All around the mess hall, German women stopped eating and stared as Corporal Greta Hoffmann, who'd survived 3 years of war, who'd maintained perfect military discipline through capture and imprisonment, who'd never once broken down, completely fell apart over a hamburger. Sergeant Weber moved first. She stood up from her seat with military precision and walked around the table to where Greta sat sobbing. For a moment, everyone expected her to bark an order, to restore discipline, to remind them all that they were German soldiers who didn't cry over enemy food. But instead, Weber did something that shocked every woman in that mess hall. She placed her hand gently on Greta's shoulder and said very quietly, "It's all right, Hoffmann. It's all right to cry. God knows we've earned it." And then Weber picked up her own hamburger, took a bite, and her eyes, those hard, disciplined warrior's eyes that had stared down death 100 times, filled with tears. She didn't sob like Greta. She just stood there with tears running down her weathered face, chewing slowly, tasting something she'd forgotten existed. Within seconds, half the women at their table were crying. Within a minute, it had spread through the entire mess hall like a contagion of grief and relief and overwhelming, impossible gratitude. The American soldiers looked panicked. The young one who'd served Greta rushed to find an officer, thinking something was terribly wrong. But Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who'd been overseeing the Labor Day event, just stood at the edge of the mess hall watching with an expression that mixed sadness and understanding. He'd served in the European theater. He'd seen what Germany looked like after the war, the rubble, the starving civilians, the children with stick-thin arms begging for chocolate. He knew what these women had survived. He knew what this food meant to them. "Let them cry," he said quietly to the concerned private. "Sometimes that's all you can do. Just let them cry it out." Greta eventually got herself under control, though her face was blotchy and her nose was running. Liesel, sitting beside her, silently handed her a napkin, the cloth napkin that had come with the meal, nicer than anything they'd had even before the war. Greta wiped her eyes, blew her nose, and looked down at her hamburger. It sat there on her plate, half-eaten, still warm, still impossible. She picked it up with shaking hands and took another bite. This time she could taste everything. Not just the overwhelming sensation of fat and protein hitting a starving system, but the individual components. The beef had a char on the outside from the grill, a slight smokiness that reminded her of summer cookouts when she was a child. The cheese, American cheese she'd later learn, a product that didn't exist in Germany, was mild and creamy, binding everything together. The ketchup was sweet and tangy. The mustard had a sharp bite. The pickles provided a crisp, vinegary contrast to the richness. The lettuce and tomato added freshness, water content, vitamins her body desperately needed. But more than the individual flavors, it was what the hamburger represented that made her cry. Because this wasn't survival rations. This wasn't the bare minimum to keep prisoners alive. This was abundance. This was generosity. This was America saying, through the language of food, "We have so much that we can give it even to you. Even to our enemies, even to people who fought against us." It was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any bomb, because it forced you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Maybe the side you fought for had been wrong about everything. My father used to say that you could tell everything about a nation by how it treats its prisoners, Margarete said quietly from across the table. She'd been eating methodically, tears streaming silently down her face the whole time. If they torture and starve them, you know that nation is built on fear and cruelty. If they treat them with basic dignity, you know that nation has laws it respects. But if they feed them hamburgers and French fries, she laughed, a slightly broken sound. What does that say? That America is so rich it can waste resources on enemies? Or that they're so confident in their victory they can afford to be generous? Both, Weber said, picking up a French fry and examining it like it was a curiosity. It's both, and that's what makes it effective. They're showing us that everything we were told was a lie. We were told Americans were weak, decadent, that their prosperity was a facade. We were told their soldiers were cowards who'd fold at the first sign of real combat. We were told they'd treat prisoners brutally, that capture meant torture and death. She ate the French fry. Instead, they give us soap and medicine and hamburgers with French fries. They ask about our dietary restrictions. They say please and thank you in our language. How do you fight an enemy like that? How do you maintain your hatred when they're being kinder than your own officers ever were? The table fell silent, because it was true and they all knew it. The Wehrmacht had not been kind to its women soldiers. They'd been useful tools, necessary parts of the war machine, but never valued as human beings. The rations had been poor even before the final collapse. Watery soup, black bread, sometimes spoiled meat. Officers had taken the best food for themselves. Medical care was minimal unless your injury made you completely useless. And the casual cruelty, the constant reminder that you were expendable, that your life mattered only insofar as it served the Reich, that had worn them down more than combat ever did. But here, in this enemy prison camp in Texas, they had beds with clean sheets. They had 3 meals a day, not great meals usually, but adequate. They had access to medical care. The guards didn't beat them or harass them. There were rules, protocols, a system that seemed designed to maintain basic human dignity even for prisoners of war. And now there were hamburgers. Hamburgers with cheese and French fries and ice-cold lemonade and the promise of pie for dessert. Things were just starting to look better when Lieutenant Morrison stepped up to a microphone at the front of the mess hall. The crying had mostly subsided, though the sound of sniffling was still audible throughout the room. Morrison cleared his throat and spoke in German, not perfect, but competent enough that everyone could understand. "Ladies," he began, and there was something in his use of that word, not prisoners, not Germans, but ladies, that made several women start crying again. "Today is Labor Day in America, a holiday where we celebrate the dignity and value of work. I want you to know that we see you as workers, as professionals, as soldiers who did your duty as you understood it. We don't hate you. We defeated your military, your government, your ideology, but we don't hate you as individuals." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "Many of you have asked when you'll be repatriated to Germany. The truth is, we don't know yet. Germany is not in a good state right now. There are food shortages, destroyed infrastructure, millions of displaced persons. The occupation authorities are still figuring out how to process returning POWs, especially women. It may be weeks. It may be months. We know this is difficult. We know you want to go home, to find your families, to start rebuilding your lives." He took a breath. "What I can tell you is this. While you're here, we will treat you with respect. We will feed you adequately. We will provide medical care. We will allow you to write letters home through the Red Cross. We will not punish you for serving your country, and we will prepare you, as best we can, for what you'll face when you return. Because we want you to go home and tell people what you experienced here. We want you to tell them that Americans are not monsters. We want you to tell them that there is a different way forward, a way based on democracy, prosperity, and human dignity rather than authoritarianism and conquest." He gestured to the food. "This hamburger you're eating, this is what peace looks like. This is what prosperity looks like. This is what happens when a nation focuses on production instead of destruction, on building instead of conquering. We're not perfect. America has problems, serious problems, but we don't starve. We don't send our children to die in pointless wars. We don't build our entire society around military dominance." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many women as he could. "We hope that when you go home, you'll remember this. You'll remember that the enemy fed you hamburgers. And maybe, just maybe, that will help build a better Germany. A Germany that doesn't need to conquer others to feel strong. A Germany that can be prosperous through peace instead of through war. The silence that followed was profound. Then slowly, Sergeant Weber stood up. Every German woman in the room turned to look at her, waiting to see what their ranking officer would do. Weber stood at attention, military perfect, and said in clear German, "Lieutenant Morrison, on behalf of the German female prisoners in this camp, I want to say..." She paused, struggling with words. "I want to say that your words today, and this food and the treatment we have received, it challenges everything we were taught. Everything we believed. It is difficult to process. But I think I speak for many of us when I say that we are grateful. For the food, yes. But more than that, for being treated like human beings instead of animals." "Thank you." Morrison looked surprised by this, then nodded slowly. "You're welcome, Sergeant. Now please sit down and finish your meal. There's apple pie for dessert, and we made enough for seconds." The meal continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Women who'd been eating in tense silence began to talk to each other in quiet voices. Some even began to talk to the American soldiers who were serving and clearing dishes, using hand gestures and broken bits of each other's languages to communicate. Liesel, whose English was better than most, found herself translating between a table of German nurses and an American medic who wanted to know about their training. The conversation was stilted at first, but it grew more animated as they discovered that medical care was medical care, no matter which uniform you wore. Greta ate her hamburger slowly, savoring every bite now that the initial shock had passed. She ate every one of her French fries, each one a small miracle of crispy perfection. She drank her lemonade, so sweet it almost hurt, so cold it made her teeth ache, so refreshing she wanted to cry again. And when an American soldier came around with slices of apple pie, she accepted one with a trembling danke that made the young man smile. The pie was still warm, the apples tender and sweet with just a hint of cinnamon. The crust was flaky and buttery. It tasted like her grandmother's apple cake, the one she used to make every autumn when the apples were ripe, before the war, before rationing, before everything became gray and terrible. Greta ate it slowly, thinking about her grandmother who died in 1941, before the worst of it, at least. She'd been lucky that way. She died in her sleep, peacefully, not knowing what was coming, not knowing that within 2 years her son would be dead, her daughter-in-law would be dead, her granddaughter Anna would be dead, and her surviving granddaughter would be sitting in a Texas prison camp eating apple pie and crying for the 3rd time in an hour. But the real shock was yet to come, because after the meal ended and the women were preparing to return to their barracks, Lieutenant Morrison approached the table where Greta sat. He was carrying something wrapped in wax paper, and he looked slightly embarrassed. "Corporal Hoffmann?" he said, reading from a paper. "Greta Hoffmann?" Greta stood at attention. "Ja, Herr Leutnant. I heard from the guards that you were the first to react emotionally to the hamburgers. I wanted to check that you're all right." "We didn't mean to upset anyone," Liesel translated quickly, and Greta felt her face burn with shame. She'd broken down. She'd cried like a child in front of everyone. She'd failed to maintain discipline, failed to represent her country with dignity, failed in every way that mattered. "I apologize, sir," she said through Liesel. "My behavior was inappropriate. It will not happen again." Morrison looked confused, then understanding dawned. "Oh no, Corporal. You don't need to apologize. I just wanted to make sure you weren't sick or in distress. Crying isn't a failure. It's not a sign of weakness. It's just human." He held out the wax paper package. "The cook wanted me to give you this. He said anyone who appreciates his cooking that much deserves extras." Greta unwrapped the package with shaking hands. Inside were 2 more hamburgers, carefully wrapped and still warm. Along with them was a note in English that Liesel read aloud. "To the lady who cried, food is love. Enjoy these tonight or tomorrow. You deserve to be full. Chef Rodriguez." Greta stared at the hamburgers, then at Lieutenant Morrison, then back at the hamburgers. I don't understand," she said in German. "Why would he give me more?" "I already ate. I had enough." "More than enough," Morrison smiled sadly, "because Chef Rodriguez grew up poor in New Mexico. He knows what it's like to be hungry. He knows what it means when someone cries over food, not because it's bad, but because it's good. Because it's more than you thought you'd ever have again. He wanted you to know that here, in America, there's enough. There's enough that we can give you extra. There's enough that you don't have to cry from gratitude. You can just eat. After they returned to the barracks, Greta sat on her bunk holding the wrapped hamburgers like they were made of gold. The other women gathered around, curious and slightly envious. Sergeant Weber examined the package with something like wonder. "You should share them," Weber said, but her voice lacked its usual command. "It would be the proper thing to do. The communal thing." Or, Margarete said quietly, she could eat them herself. "Because for once, just once, we don't have to share every scrap. For once there's enough that someone can have extra without someone else going hungry." The two women looked at each other, an entire conversation happening in that glance. Finally, Weber nodded. "You're right. Hoffmann, those are yours. But perhaps you might share one with someone who means something to you. Not out of obligation, out of friendship." Greta looked around at the women of Barrack 6. They'd been strangers when they arrived, collected from different units, different battles, different parts of Germany's collapse. But 6 weeks of shared imprisonment had forged them into something like family. She thought about eating both hamburgers herself, indulging in pure selfishness for the first time in years. But then she thought about Anna, her little sister, who'd always shared her candy rations even when she was hungry. Who'd given Greta her warm socks during a cold winter because you have to go outside more than I do. "Liesel," Greta said. "Would you share one with me? Tonight, after lights out, we can split it." Like a midnight feast, Liesel's face lit up. "Really? You'd share with me? You're my friend." Friends share hamburgers. That night, after lights out, Greta and Liesel sat on Greta's bunk with a single flashlight and one wrapped hamburger between them. They'd carefully cut it in half using a knife Margaret had borrowed from the mess hall. The hamburger was cold now, but somehow that made it even more precious. They could eat it slowly, savoring every bite without the urgency of a meal line moving behind them. "My mother used to pack my lunch for school," Liesel said quietly, taking a small bite. "Nothing fancy. Usually just bread with margarine, maybe some cheese if we had it. But once a month, on payday, she'd put a piece of chocolate in my lunchbox. Just a small piece, but it meant everything. It meant we were doing okay. It meant there was enough." She looked at her half of the hamburger. "This feels like that. Like someone's mother packed this lunch and put something special in it just for us." Greta thought about that. Thought about Chef Rodriguez, who probably had a mother somewhere in New Mexico. Thought about Lieutenant Morrison, who probably had a mother who worried about him. Thought about all the American soldiers who'd served this meal, boys with mothers and sisters and girlfriends back home. Boys who'd been taught to see Germans as enemies, but had chosen to see them as people instead. "Do you think we were wrong?" Greta asked suddenly. "About everything. About the war, the Reich, all of it. Were we just completely, utterly wrong?" Liesel was quiet for a long time. I think we were lied to. About who the enemy was. About what we were fighting for. About what would happen if we lost. They told us the Americans would rape and murder us. Instead, they're giving us hamburgers." She took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. "But I don't think we were wrong to fight for Germany. Not Germany, the ideology, but Germany, the place. Germany, the people. Our families, our homes, our culture. That part wasn't wrong. Where we went wrong was believing that to protect those things, we needed to conquer everyone else. We needed to be superior instead of just enough." "My father said something similar," Greta admitted, "right before I enlisted. He said that Germany had everything it needed to be great. Smart people, strong culture, good land. But that wasn't enough for the leadership. They wanted to be the greatest. They wanted to dominate. And in trying to be the greatest, we lost everything that made us good." She looked at her half-eaten hamburger. "This hamburger is good. Not because it's trying to be the greatest hamburger ever made, but because it's well-made, generous, and given freely. Maybe that's what we should have learned, how to be good instead of great." The conversation continued late into the night. Two young German women sitting in a Texas prison camp eating cold hamburgers and trying to understand how their entire world had been inverted. Around them, other women in Barrack 6 lay in their bunks pretending to sleep, but actually listening. Because they were all asking themselves the same questions. They were all trying to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they were experiencing. They were all wondering if going home meant returning to a lie. Or if maybe, just maybe, Germany could be rebuilt on truth instead. The weeks following the Labor Day feast brought changes to the camp that no one could have anticipated. What started with hamburgers became something much deeper, a slow, painful process of deprogramming and rebuilding. The German women began to emerge from their shells of military discipline and propaganda-induced fear, and what they found underneath was complicated and raw. Greta found herself drawn to the camp library, a small building she'd never dared enter before. It contained books in multiple languages, including German, books that had been banned in the Reich, philosophy, history, political theory. She read remarks, "All quiet on the Western Front," which had been forbidden as defeatist literature, and wept at its accuracy. She read American newspapers, translated by Liesel, and learned about the concentration camps, the systematic murder, the scope of Nazi atrocities that they'd been told were enemy propaganda. "Did you know?" Margaret asked one evening as a group of them sat in the barracks reading these revelations. About the camps, the death camps. "Did any of you know?" The silence was deafening. Finally, Weber spoke, her voice hollow. "We knew there were camps. We were told they were work camps, prisons for enemies of the state. We were told the prisoners were criminals, communists, people who'd betrayed Germany." She looked at the newspaper in her hands, at the photographs of skeletal prisoners, of mass graves, of evidence so overwhelming it couldn't be denied. "But this is not imprisonment. This is industrial murder. This is evil so profound I don't have words for it." "I saw a transport once," a quiet voice said. It was Corporal Anna Baumann, a driver who rarely spoke, in Poland. 1943. I was driving supplies to a forward position and we passed a train. Cattle cars. I could hear screaming from inside. Children screaming. I asked my commanding officer what it was, and he said it was none of my concern, that I should focus on my duty and forget what I saw. She looked up, her eyes haunted. I tried to forget. I convinced myself it was prisoners being relocated, or supplies, or anything but what it actually was. Because if it was what it sounded like, children screaming in cattle cars, then that meant I was part of something unspeakable. And I couldn't be part of something like that. I was German. We were the good guys. We were fighting for our survival, our culture, our people. We couldn't be the ones putting children in cattle cars. But we were, Greta said flatly. Maybe we didn't personally do it. Maybe we didn't know the full extent. But we were part of the machine that made it possible. Every supply run, every communication transmitted, every wounded soldier we patched up so he could go back to fighting. It all supported the system that did this. The guilt settled over them like a physical weight. This was different from the guilt of defeat, different from the shame of capture. This was moral guilt, the realization that they'd been on the wrong side of history in the most fundamental way possible. They hadn't just lost a war, they'd served evil, but the real shock was yet to come. Because 3 days after this conversation, Lieutenant Morrison arranged for something unprecedented. A screening of footage from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. He gave them a choice. They could attend or not. No one would be forced. But he strongly recommended they see it because you need to know what you were part of, even if you didn't know it at the time. Every woman from Barrack 6 attended. They sat in the camp's small theater, the same room where they'd watched American movies and newsreels and watched footage of hell. Piles of corpses, walking skeletons, children with eyes too old for their faces, British soldiers weeping as they tried to help people too far gone to save. Bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves because there were too many to bury individually, because disease was spreading, because the dead outnumbered the living. Greta made it through 15 minutes before she had to run outside and vomit. She wasn't alone. Half the women left at various points, unable to stomach the reality of what their nation had done. But the other half stayed, forced themselves to watch, forced themselves to bear witness, because not watching felt like another betrayal. Another way of hiding from the truth. When the screening ended, no one spoke. They filed out in silence, faces blank with shock. Sergeant Weber, who'd maintained rigid composure through everything, sat on a bench outside the theater and stared at nothing for 2 hours. When Greta finally approached her, Weber looked up with eyes that had seen too much. "My daughter," Weber said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My Suki. She died at Hiroshima, killed by an American bomb. I've hated the Americans for it, raged against the injustice of her death. But now, she gestured vaguely toward the theater. Now I see what we did, what Germany did. Millions, not soldiers in war, but civilians systematically murdered, children. How do I mourn my daughter when my nation did that to someone else's children? How do I claim the moral high ground about her death when we... She couldn't finish the sentence. Greta sat beside her. I don't think you have to choose, she said slowly, working through her own thoughts. Your daughter's death is still a tragedy. Your grief is still valid. But yes, Germany's crimes are also real. Both things can be true. The Americans who killed Suki were wrong to bomb civilians, even if it ended the war faster. And Germany was wrong to build death camps. Neither one cancels out the other. But how do I live with it? Weber asked. How do I go home and tell people what I saw? They'll call me a traitor. They'll say I've been brainwashed by American propaganda. They'll say these films are fake, that the camps weren't as bad as reported, that the Jews exaggerated their suffering for sympathy. She looked at Greta with desperate eyes. How do I convince anyone when I spent years convincing myself? That night, Lieutenant Morrison did something unexpected. He invited any women who wanted to talk, about the screening, about the war, about anything, to meet in the mess hall for coffee. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't interrogation. Just an open invitation to process what they'd seen. To Greta's surprise, more than half the camp attended. They sat at tables with coffee. Real coffee. Not the roasted grain substitute they'd had in Germany. And Lieutenant Morrison simply asked, "What questions do you have?" The flood started slowly, then became a torrent. How long had the camps operated? Who knew about them? Why didn't anyone stop them? What would happen to the perpetrators? What would happen to Germany? Would they be punished for having served? Would their families be punished? Could Germany ever recover from this? How could a nation commit such atrocities? How had ordinary people like them, allowed it to happen? Morrison answered what he could, honestly and without sugarcoating. Yes, the major war criminals would be tried at Nuremberg. No, ordinary soldiers who simply did their duty wouldn't be prosecuted. Yes, Germany would be occupied and denazified. No, Germany wouldn't be destroyed. The goal was rehabilitation, not revenge. Yes, it would take generations to heal from this. Yes, the world would remember what Germany did. But also yes, Germany could rebuild if Germans faced the truth, took responsibility, and committed to being better. The hamburger I gave you on Labor Day, Morrison said, that wasn't just food. It was a message. It was saying that despite everything, despite the camps and the war and the millions dead, we still see you as human beings capable of redemption. We're not going to do to you what you did to your victims. We're going to feed you, clothe you, send you home, and hope that you build something better. Why? Greta asked, her voice breaking. After what you showed us today, after what Germany did, why show us any mercy at all? We don't deserve hamburgers. We don't deserve kindness. We deserve to be punished. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. Because revenge doesn't end cycles of violence. It perpetuates them. After World War I, the Allies humiliated Germany, imposed crushing reparations, destroyed your economy and your pride. And what happened? 20 years later, another war, worse than the first. We're not making that mistake again. This time, we're going to help you rebuild. We're going to show you that prosperity comes from peace, not conquest. We're going to prove that democracy and human rights aren't just propaganda. They're real, and they work. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But here's the thing, we can only help if you want to change. If you go home and tell people the truth about what you saw here, if you reject the Nazi ideology that brought you to this point, if you commit to building a Germany that never does this again, we can give you hamburgers, but you have to do the hard work of changing hearts and minds. Can you do that? The question hung in the air. Could they? Could a group of traumatized, defeated, guilt-ridden women go home and convince an entire nation to face its sins and choose a different path? It seemed impossible. But then Greta thought about that first hamburger, the one that had made her cry. She thought about Chef Rodriguez's note, "Food is love. You deserve to be full." She thought about American soldiers asking about their dietary restrictions, about movies on Saturday nights, about libraries full of forbidden books, about being treated like human beings instead of monsters. "I'll try," Greta said. I can't promise I'll succeed. I can't promise anyone will listen, but I'll try. I'll tell people about the hamburgers in the camps, about American kindness and German crimes, about how the enemy treated us better than our own government did. And maybe, just maybe, someone will listen. Others began to speak up, making similar commitments. Not everyone. Some women were too broken, too traumatized, too indoctrinated to let go of the old beliefs. But enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to plant seeds that might, in time, grow into something better. Things were just starting to look better when, in late September, the camp received word that repatriation would begin in October. The women would be sent home in groups over several months, processed through displaced persons camps, and eventually returned to whatever remained of their families and homes. The news brought mixed emotions: relief at finally going home, terror at what they'd find there, guilt about leaving the relative safety and comfort of the camp. Greta's repatriation date was set for November 15th. As the day approached, she found herself dreading it more than she'd dreaded anything in the war. Because the camp, as strange as it was, had become safe. Here she was fed, she had a bed, she had friends, she had access to books and movies and coffee and occasionally, on special occasions, hamburgers. What did she have in Germany? Her family was dead. Her city was rubble. The economy was destroyed. She'd be returning to a country occupied by foreign powers, its people starving and bitter, its future uncertain. On her last night in the camp, Chef Rodriguez made hamburgers again, a goodbye meal for the women departing. He'd done this for every repatriation group, insisted on it despite the extra work. Everyone deserves a good last meal, he'd say. And maybe when they're hungry in Germany, they'll remember that Americans fed them. Maybe that matters. Greta ate her hamburger slowly, trying to memorize every flavor, every texture. Lieutenant Morrison stopped by her table, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "Corporal Hoffmann," he said, "I wanted to give you something before you leave. A reminder." She opened the package to find a book, a cookbook in German, titled American Classics. It was full of recipes: hamburgers, apple pie, fried chicken, chocolate cake. Food she'd tasted in this camp and would probably never taste again. But more than recipes, there were notes in the margins, written by Chef Rodriguez in broken German. Tips on making things with limited ingredients. Substitutions for when you couldn't find beef or butter. Ways to make a little stretch into a lot. He wanted you to be able to make these things, Morrison explained. Even in Germany, even with limited resources. He said cooking for people is how you show love, and everyone deserves to be loved. Even former enemies. Greta clutched the cookbook to her chest, tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time since arriving in this camp. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. For the food, for the truth, for treating us like humans. I'll remember. I'll tell people. I promise." The next morning, Greta boarded a truck with 20 other women bound for the train station. As the camp disappeared behind them, she held her cookbook and thought about hamburgers. About how a simple sandwich had broken through years of propaganda and hatred. About how food could be love, how mercy could be strength, how enemies could become something like friends. She went home to a Germany that was exactly as broken as she'd feared. Hamburg was rubble. Her neighborhood was gone. Her house was a crater. She lived in a displaced persons camp for 8 months, surviving on Allied rations that were never quite enough but were better than nothing. She worked as a translator for the British occupation forces, using the English she'd learned from Liesel. She told everyone who would listen about what she'd seen, about the camps, about American kindness, about hamburgers and second chances. Most people didn't want to hear it. They called her a traitor, a sympathizer, a naive fool, but some listened. A few understood, and slowly, painfully, Germany began to change. Not all at once. Not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to build something different. Something better. 20 years later, in 1965, Greta Hoffmann owned a small restaurant in rebuilt Hamburg. It was American style, serving hamburgers and fries and apple pie. The recipes came from Chef Rodriguez's cookbook, adapted for German ingredients and tastes. Above the counter hung a black and white photograph of a young woman in a Wehrmacht uniform, crying over a hamburger in a Texas prison camp. When customers asked about the photograph, Greta told them the story. All of it. The war, the camps, the capture, the hamburger that changed everything. Some walked out, offended that she'd display such a moment of German weakness, but others stayed, ordered hamburgers, tasted what she tasted, and understood in some small way that food could be love, that mercy could be strength, that enemies could become friends, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply feeding someone who expected to starve. Her restaurant became a small legend in Hamburg, a place where former soldiers, both German and Allied, could meet on neutral ground, where hamburgers served as a kind of communion, a shared acknowledgement of humanity that survived even the worst humanity could do. It wasn't perfect. It didn't solve anything. But it was something, a small light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the ashes of total war, something good could grow. Something as simple and profound as a hamburger, made with care, served with love, eaten with gratitude. And every year on Labor Day, a holiday Germany didn't celebrate. But Greta never forgot. She closed the restaurant and made hamburgers for free for anyone who wanted them, especially for children, especially for those who looked hungry. Because Chef Rodriguez had been right, food is love. And everyone, no matter who they were or what they'd done, deserved to be full, deserved to be loved, deserved a second chance to be better than their worst moments. The cookbook, worn and stained and precious, sat in a place of honor in her kitchen. And sometimes, when the restaurant was closed and she was alone, Greta would open it and read Rodriguez's notes in the margins. Would remember a Texas prison camp where enemies became human beings. Would taste in her memory that first impossible hamburger. Would cry again, not from hunger this time, but from gratitude. For having survived, for having learned, for having been shown mercy when she deserved judgment, for having been fed when she expected to starve, for having been given a hamburger that changed her life.